Welcome everybody to today's seminar in the college's virtual seminar series. I'm LaReesa Wolfenbarger, Associate Dean of Natural Sciences and Research for the College of Arts and Sciences. I'll be moderating today's seminar entitled Stories of Love for the Great Plains, Scholarship, Meaning, and Attachment. Throughout the year, we've had a seminar once a month to showcase the work of our faculty, staff, and students and what they're doing to address critical challenges of our time. For today's seminar, we'll talk with 4 faculty members whose research and scholarship takes place here in the Great Plains. While we will talk about scholarship, we'll also explore the sense of place that arises when your research and scholarship takes place in a location or a region for a really long period of time. And my hope is that this inspires you to reflect on your own relationship with the environment, whether it's a garden, a park, or a preserve that you find incredibly special. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Dr. Tom Bragg is a professor of biology and the director of Glacier Creek Preserve. Dr. Christina Dando is professor and chair of the Geography and Geology Department. Harmon Maher is a professor of geology, and Dr. John Price is a professor of English. And so I'm going to start with Dr. Maher and ask this question. What can you describe for us your broad field of study, and then just more specifically what your research and scholarship is in the field?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. I consider myself a field geologist. So I'll go to an area and I'll map the geology, often construct 3-dimensional models, and then figure out the history that led to that architecture, if you like. Within that, I specialize in how the earth moves, how it deforms, faults and folds, earthquakes, fractures, and veins there. And then one specific project within that is I look at how sediments get transformed into sedimentary rocks, part of the rock cycle, and the fractures that develop in that and the changes that occur during that transformation.
Thank you.
Of course.
Dr. Bragg, would you like to take a stab at that question?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm not sure I do as much interesting stuff as Harmon does, but I'm a plant community ecologist, basically with specializing in fire ecology, effective fire in different ecosystems. That's kind of the short version. I go to areas and instead of looking at below, I look around, but I look below but at the plants instead of the substrate. However, I do know the substrate is critical to the system. But I look most of our research is focusing on the effect of fire on plant diversity, if you will. But I've expanded a lot beyond that into other areas, as you'll see when later on we talk about some of the things that I do. But generally, when I go to an area, I have areas that I've established a long time ago, and I go back and look at those sites year after year to see the effect of treatment. I'll mention a little bit later on in some of the long-term research plots at Glacier Creek Preserve when we deal with that.
Great. Dr. Dando.
I am a human geographer. Geography is a discipline that crosses between the physical sciences, something very close and overlapping with geology, through human geography, and into geospatial techniques. And so we use a lot of maps and mapping as analytical tools. My own specialty is in human perception of landscape, how humans react to and interact with our landscapes. I'm interested in media and the ways in which these perceptions manifest in photographs and writing and film. And I do a lot of work also on gender.
Thank you. Dr. Price.
Yeah, I'm the director of the creative nonfiction writing program in English, and I'm a creative nonfiction writer. It's kind of an umbrella term that includes a lot of different genres like essays, autobiography, literary journalism, prose poetry. But within that, my focus is nature writing, and specifically writing about tall grass prairies ecosystems. I'm interested in researching the science of it. I'm not a scientist, but I'm interested in do a lot of research that way. And the folks that were part of this discussion have been really important to me that way. But like like Christina, I'm interested in human perceptions of the landscape from a personal perspective, but also from a community perspective. How those attitudes, those emotional relationships have influenced the prairie over the years. And so I've tried also to research and restore lost nature writing about the tallgrass prairie that we don't see a lot of tallgrass prairie nature writing even now in anthologies. So that's another area where I've tried to do some additional work.
Nice, very nice. Thank you. All right, so as I mentioned in the introduction, and all of you, of course, are aware that you work in places in the Great Plains. So the next question is why or how did your focus on this place begin? And I know some of you work in a particular location. You know, Dr. Dando is working across a broader region as a geographer, but I guess I'd like you to introduce the place to the audience. Harmon, why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay. So the place I absolutely love to work in are the Badlands. And for geologists, Badlands are good. And this is just a picture of the national park, the Big Badlands National Park. Those are 3 UNO students. We had a project working there. And you can see the exquisite exposures, this geology exposed in 3 dimensions. You can walk around the ridge and see what's on the other side. If I could have the next slide. So the Big Badlands is one place we've worked. And then this is Toadstool Park. This is actually a geology field trip that was out there fairly recently. There are 6 UNO students there. It's just an exquisite place. And this is the first place that I sort of became attached to and realized the rich research possibilities in these Badlands there. And then the next slide, please. And this is a place where I've been working more recently. It's sort of out of the way and undiscovered in some ways. Absolutely tremendously beautiful. This is Slim Buttes in northwest South Dakota. You can see there's a lot going on geologically. Things are chopped up and they're tilted and so forth. Relatively not well understood there, but I hope to go back here with students this summer. Next, please. And then this is just a few last photos here showing more students. And that was one of the things that strongly led me to focus in on these Badlands, with the opportunities in there for teaching students there. And you can see a little drone. That's the new tool of choice. It's just fantastic how much data you can collect and how much landscape you can cover with that. We can build these 3-dimensional computer models there. So that's a quick introduction into place. In terms of my introduction to it, I came to UNO in 1983, headed right out to Toadstool because there was a fault there, and had the experience that a lot of my subsequent students had. And that is, I had no idea that there was anything like this in Nebraska there. And for a geologist, getting your students out in the field, that is primary there. And so that was sort of after just exploring what's there and being convinced of its richness. The next thing was what a fantastic opportunity for field trips and for undergraduate research. So that's a little bit of how I got into it and where I focused some of my efforts.
Thank you. That's great. I have to point out, I was debating between a long introduction or a short introduction. And if I had done a long introduction, one of the things I was going to point out about Harmon is in his book, Roadside Geology of Nebraska, he has, I think the first line of the description is, Nebraska geology is as exciting as the Cornhuskers. So that gives you a feeling for his enthusiasm. So Tom, how about you introduce your place?
Well, you know, as I got to thinking about this question, it occurred to me that basically, and I hate to drag you through my entire life, but it'll be short. But basically, I found myself going from one ecosystem to the next and making a circular tour out of it. So I'm going to go quickly just to give you some idea. When I was a kid, my dad was in the horse cavalry. He was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. And so we lived there for a while in the plains of Kansas. From there, eventually we moved to Germany. So I got used to the pine forest in the German area because after the war, that's where he was stationed. Then we moved to California, where I learned, first of all, about the redwood forests of California. So the tall trees that I got used to living in. I actually was a Boy Scout camp counselor in a redwood area. So I got used to the redwood forest. And then I went to school at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in the Chaparral area. So the Chaparral of Southern California. And from the Chaparral area, I went back to Kansas in the 1st Infantry Division. I was on the military at the time. And between that and Kansas, coming back to Kansas State, I spent some time in the forests of Southeast Asia. And all these different ecosystems have their own unique features, every one of them. But I look at my route, if you will, basically going from the redwood forest to the tallgrass prairie, where it's great extremes, and they don't call redwoods tall, but they do call it the tallgrass prairie. But in the tallgrass prairie in particularly, some of the reasons about how I got here, I want to explain this picture just a little bit. At Kansas State University, I was accepted as someone with a business degree background. That was my undergraduate degree by Lloyd Hulbert. And the reason I mention his name, he's the one who's responsible for putting together Konza Prairie Natural Research Area. It's one of the key tallgrass prairie research sites in the nation. And I watched him as he put this together over maybe 20 years. I wasn't there 20 years, but he'd been working on it for a long time. And I watched his persistence in trying to get this place established and set up as a key research site. In addition to that, he's the one that introduced me to fire burning, basically. I had my first experience there fighting a fire with him, or fighting a fire that got away with him, I should say. So I learned about prescribed burning there, and that kind of leads me to how I came to UNO, because at UNO, I don't think I even had a clue what Omaha was about when I came here. But one of my job duties was to take care of what was then Allwine Prairie Preserve. And that's that little square that you can kind of see in the middle of this picture where it says Glacier Creek. It's a little different color. So over the years, we've been able to take that Glacier Creek and expand it. But my point is that I watched Lloyd Hulbert make this preserve down south. And to some extent, I'm sure I'm carrying forward to here, trying to not duplicate, but kind of parallel some of what he did, but in a metropolitan area, which has its own unique features. And so that's kind of my background, is getting to how I managed to preserve, because I was brought here with the job duty being one of those things. And my introduction to fire was basically through him in the field, the old-fashioned way to do things. So that's kind of how I ended up with Glacier Creek Preserve as being the preserve director. Basically, we developed that into a significant site, from going from that small square in the middle to most recently acquiring all the land around it that you can see, and then establishing it. So if you want to go to the next picture, next slide. It's a diverse site with a lot of diversity in it, plants and animals. It's not just a unique site, but one of the unique features of this particular site, next slide, is that in 1978, I established a set of research plots, which you can kind of see in the distance there. This is the longest running fire research plots in North America, and perhaps elsewhere. It's among those that are unique in that sense. And we've actually had visitors here from elsewhere to kind of see this research site. So that's kind of how I got here, managing the preserve. I also got sidetracked. I was able to do some work in Australia and other places as well, because UNO is a great place to do that from. So that's kind of how I got where I am.
Tom, do you want to tell the audience the importance of fire for a grassland?
Sure. One of the reasons why coming here was, well, I guess why being here is important, is that the tallgrass prairie, where we are in the eastern part of the Great Plains, in the absence of fire, you get trees. And my Ph.D. dissertation was about exactly what happens when you don't burn. You get trees. And so the natural prairie, the prairie that you're looking at here, basically is a tallgrass prairie. And without fire, we have enough precipitation here to support a tree community. But historically, when the glaciers receded, fires increased. Native American fires, lightning-caused fires. And so fires maintain this ecosystem as a prairie. In the absence of fire, you end up getting two things. One, you get trees come in, but also the native plants that are adapted to the site decline. And so what we have in this particular site, just a little bit on Glacier Creek real quickly, that diversity, among the diversity we have, is a significant population of, like, the regal fritillaries, which only occurs in good quality tallgrass prairie. Remember, this is a restored site. So we're maintaining a site here. In the absence of fire, you lose the tallgrass prairie and you lose those species associated with it. So the reason why fire is important is because it maintains what our natural history was. This area here was not treed in spite of what you see, but because of the suppression of fire, we have a lot of trees coming in. The unique feature of Glacier Creek Preserve is that it has an entire watershed. I may get a chance to talk about that later, but it has an entire watershed maintained as a prairie, which is what's unique about this particular site. So that's the short soapbox about fire. I can get longer if you want.
Perfect. Perfect. Chris, please.
So I have lived now most of my life on the Great Plains. My family moved to North Dakota when I was 10. I graduated, did my undergrad at the University of North Dakota, but I never felt like I belonged. And when I started doing my graduate work at Madison, Wisconsin, I was kind of searching. My original plan fell through and I was kind of feeling around for a new topic. And I was in a great class on the American West, the geography of the American West with a geographer named Tom Vail, who's actually a biogeographer. And it gave me an opportunity to think about different things. And one of the things that I became really interested in was the concept of landscape. And when we think about landscape, we're thinking about taking in a bit of the Earth's surface through the human eye. You know, so you think about standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon saying, wow, that's a fabulous landscape. Or looking at a landscape painting, or thinking about how we set up plants and things around our house. And we call that landscaping, right? So landscape always involves the human eye in some ways. And so I started exploring and ended up doing my master's thesis on whether the Dust Bowl impacted how humans wrote about the plains. And then for my PhD, literally looked through the human eye and looked at turn of the century photograph albums of the Great Plains. And so the image on the upper left is actually from my dissertation. And Elizabeth Roberts was just a ranch wife. She was nobody. Well, in some ways, she was quite a phenomenal lady. She was a game warden in the teens in Western North Dakota, which is pretty crazy. But she just happened to get some cameras. And in those days, you bought Kodaks that were preloaded and you just point and shoot. And that included panoramics. And she took some amazing photography. And this gave me a chance to see what landscapes were important enough to her to keep, to take an image of and put it in a photograph album, and then not only hand it down to her kids, but then have it end up in the North Dakota Historical Society. So she valued these landscapes. And this gives me a sense, again, of how people perceive landscapes. So this kind of is what led to my interest and work on the plains, but it also eventually led me back to the plains. I never imagined that I would end up in a place where I can teach geography of the Great Plains regularly. And I am very interested not only in historical, but also contemporary work on the plains and in gender, as you can see in this incredible Alexander Hogue painting, Mother Earth Laid Bare. Sometimes gender can deal with how do we look at the landscape and how we react to landscape, but sometimes the landscape is actually personified as gendered. So when I lived in North Dakota, I didn't feel like I belonged, but being here in Nebraska, I've really come to realize that you know, particularly if I'm driving up 29 from like Kansas City and I see a beautiful sunset and I catch one of those sunsets that lasts, you know, it seems like hours. That's when I feel like I'm home. So for me, it is that the whole expanse of the plains. I want the big landscape. I want the big sky. And that's for me, the plains that I love.
Thank you for that. John.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between Chris's story and my own. It's you know, I grew up here about a couple hours from here in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Sixth generation in my family to live in Western Iowa. My kids are the seventh. And yet I had no understanding, appreciation for the natural history of the prairies in Iowa or this region at all. I couldn't have identified, you know, a stalk of blue stem under threat when I was growing up. There was no sense of identification, no emotional connection at all. to that native landscape other than the agricultural landscape that surrounded my town and that I grew up in. It was also a troubled landscape. I grew up in the 80s during the farm crisis with the human toll of that economic disaster. So, you know, when I went to college at Iowa, there was a sense of almost exile from place, and the plan was to leave. And I don't think I'm unique among some people growing up in this region. It wasn't until graduate school, actually, when my wife and I were living in small town Belle Plaine, Iowa, and I was finishing up my graduate degree. She was teaching, and it was 1993, and we had those massive floods in Iowa, and the ditches and fields outside of our house remained unplowed, and these really bizarre, freaky plants started growing up in the ditches and in the surrounding landscape that I did not know, I did not recognize. There was all these birds I'd never seen, like, you know, bluebirds. I mean, stuff that in my agricultural area I hardly had ever, you know, pelicans, cyclones of pelicans. I mean, it was crazy, and but it was beautiful, and I wanted to find out more about it. So I purchased the one prairie guide that was out there that I knew of. Picked up John Madson's book too by accident in a used bookstore, and started to go around in the ditches and try to figure out what this was, what this thing was, this beautiful thing that was emerging. And that led to a kind of conversion moment where, you know, I understood really for the first time the magnificence of the natural history of the prairies in this region. And at the same time, also the magnitude of its loss. That's something I also did not appreciate, the immense loss of life that has occurred in this area. But that led me also to appreciate and to care about what remained. And I began to think about the relationship between my own field of study, creative writing, and this landscape that I was newly caring about because of this natural history. So, like all, you know, like a lot of young people, I hopped in the car and I went out and camped in prairie sites around the region. I'm not a camper, so this was a big deal for me, and still not a camper. And I interviewed writers who had committed to writing about place, and not just from a distance, which was true for a lot of Midwestern writers. They left and then wrote about it. I was interested in a different kind of relationship between writer and place. So Linda Hazelstrom, Dan O'Brien, Mary Swander in Iowa, because I truly did not know what that relationship, that kind of life looked like for a writer growing up in this region, to attach yourself to place and to write about it and make it at the heart of what you were doing. And that was a revelation for me, and that eventually became my first book. Before I even, I had that commitment before I even took this job here. But when I got the job here and was introduced to the Loess Hills, which I knew about in the abstract, again, only lived a couple hours away, but again, knew virtually nothing about them, how special they were, how unique they were in the world. And here they were, right, right in my home state, right, right here along the river. And as some of you know, they stretch from South Dakota down to Missouri, right? They're 200, 300 foot high, glacial silt created in the wake of the glaciers that left this region. That dust blew and started to build up on this side of the river. They contain a lot of special ecosystems to this area and creatures. I'm still learning about them. That's one of the wonderful, beautiful things about what the Loess Hills have taught me, is that there's still some mystery left, at least for me, in this landscape, which I thought was sort of beyond hope. Beyond. I thought it was overdetermined and carry that kind of mystery and specialness that other wilderness areas do. But people like Tom and Christina and Harmon and LaReesa and others have liberated me from that, helped liberate me from that prejudice. And I just think it's one of the most special and important things in my life to be living near these magnificent hills and raising my children in them.
Thank you. So some of you have probably answered. Oh, sorry. Are there more slides?
Nope, I just had the two.
Okay. All right. I wasn't sure. So some of you have probably answered this, and some of you maybe want to, you can say more or not, just opt in as you wish. But I'm wondering if you remember your initial impressions of the place and your expectations. You know, did you think that you would be working, you know, at this place or at this region for as long as you have?
Well, I know I wasn't planning to stay here more than a year or two myself.
Fair enough.
I mean, at the time, jobs were hard to come by when I came out. And so this was an offer that came. I got the offer in August to start teaching in August. So it was a last minute thing. The person they really wanted turned down the job at the last minute. And so I was hired from back then. And so I had really no expectations. I was more questions than expectations. I don't think I consciously had used the word Omaha, period. And so the University of Nebraska, I knew about them because they kept coming down for football at K-State, which is where I was going to school. But so I really didn't have a whole lot of expectations coming here. I wasn't disappointed. That's one way to come and not be disappointed, is don't have expectations. But this certainly turned out to be a great place to work. I've been able to do all kinds of things using this as a base. I've learned about the prairie. I've learned about things that I didn't really know much about. You know, the diversity of the site is equally diverse, even more so than something like the redwood forest, for example, which have a relatively low diversity compared to these systems here. And that what was mentioned earlier, the idea of seeing the whole sky from the sunset to sunrise, you know, that's something that you don't see in other places, in forested areas like that I came from. So I had no expectations. I was not disappointed, basically.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I can say that it was very similar for me when I first came here. I was not expecting to stay here, but within 3 or 4 years, it was clear that this was a very opportunity-rich place. Mm-hmm. And settled in, and it's been over 35 years now.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I was in awe of the Loess Hills when I was able to encounter them when I first got the job here. And I actually did intend to stay if they would keep me for as long as I can, because of that commitment to place, but also because I love UNO and my colleagues and students. And I think one of the real gifts of my time here, for me anyway, has been Glacier Creek, Prairie, which Tom and Barbie and others have introduced me to. And I take my students out there, my nature writing students, to encounter that place. And I really appreciated seeing the work that Tom did in trying to preserve that place and expand that place. And I remember him talking about how important it was to preserve the aesthetic aspects of the prairie, as well as the ecological. There were reasons to not allow houses on that or try to fight those housing developments on the edge of the prairie that were ecological, but they were also aesthetic, because without, that experience of seeing sky meet earth, it's not entirely an authentic prairie from the perspective of those who are experiencing it. So, he and others have, I think, reinforced this idea that there's a lot of overlap, and important overlap, between the humanities and the sciences, and a lot that we can do for one another. And this has been a very fruitful place for that kind of exploration.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, let me just add one little element, and that's so I didn't think I was going to be here, but I also was hired as a temporary, visiting faculty at first, so I really wasn't supposed to stay. But one of the nice things about staying is the fact that I've been able to collaborate and work with all of you. I mean, for the people listening, you may not realize this, but we all know each other and interact with each other and talk with each other. And to be in a community, I mean, if I was at a different university off the plains, I would be alone talking about the plains, and it would be even harder. But to be in a community where I can interact with people and exchange ideas and even interact in this forum, is pretty amazing. That makes it all the richer.
All right, so now I want to
just jump in real quick to reinforce what Christine said and what John said also. Glacier Creek Preserve is not just about the biology. Actually, we have people with chemistry and geography, geology as well, other people like Ashley Deer. But we also have this human dimension, which is kind of what have been mentioned. We have a site there, an archaeological site. That's a site that they found roughly 1100 BC. 1100 is present, the date for the present conditions there. That's the present estimate. So the preserve is a connecting point for all these different disciplines. I'm not trying to sell the preserve, but I am in a way, because it is a place where a lot of different disciplines can come together and see a whole variety of things. Everything from the pioneer cemetery to the Native American people presence there, from which they've extracted the fact that there was basically the conditions were drought conditions when the people were here, based on some of the findings that they found. I think I think that we do all know each other. We've all worked together in various ways, but I think that one of the things about the faculty here is that we do work together kind of on things more so than I think we would at a larger school with bigger expectations.
Thanks, Tom. So I want to move on to kind of connecting with the research and scholarship that you do, and ask you about how, you know, the place that you've described has made your research and scholarship unique or special or relevant, you know, whichever of those adjectives you want to, you know, kind of latch onto. And at this point, let's just have a conversation and you guys can jump in when you want. Or I'll call on you. John?
I hate silence, so I always say things, get people started and give them a reason to say something to correct me. But you know, every place one goes is unique in its own way. They all have unique features. I think all of us realize that, the different places that have been mentioned here today. What's unique about this place as far as my scholarship goes, my ability to do this work, was something that I mentioned earlier, is that because the tallgrass prairie is fire adapted, it gave me a place to pursue this area of fire ecology, which is a particular area. Not that other areas don't burn, but this particular system does, and I did have some experience in that. So it's not unique in the sense that there's no other place that burns, but it is unique in giving me the opportunity to expand my particular interest in research. And the fact that that there is a response to fire also is just another component of this. That the prairie does respond to fire. Those long-term research plots, for example, are showing different responses to different type of fire treatments. And so that kind of information is exactly what my study is about, what I'm trying to do.
It just to build on what Tom said about how every place is unique, and nature writing is, draws from the details of the particular place. So prairie nature writing is different from other kinds of nature writing because of those particulars. In terms of how it's helped my research, I think it's related in a way to the fact that the unfortunate fact that there's so little prairie left relative to other places, that there's also been a scarcity of nature writing about the prairies, because so much of that destruction occurred in the 19th century before there was a time to establish a nature writing tradition here, as opposed to the Sierras with Muir or somewhere else. So when I grew up again thinking that there wasn't much to write about here that way, but when I first sent out my nature writing to an editor in Boston, they were like, "Oh, it's good to get a nature piece from the Midwest. We don't get many essays about the prairie. We don't get, it underscored the need for that kind of writing. And I tell my students this too, right? That we need more voices that are writing out of a sense of connection and care and love for this place, because there are so few that really understand it and appreciate it compared to some other landscapes that are here in the U.S. So there's a lot of work to do, and that's exciting, I think, and inspiring.
Just to spin off what you were saying, John, part of this goes to the perception of the plains,
Yes.
Why do we need nature writers of plains? It's all just grass, right? It's just grass. We were talking about this last night, and I'm teaching a class in environmental conservation. People look at grasslands, and if you don't understand grasslands, you think it's just one thing, but it's incredible diversity of species.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just say that came home to me when I was researching the tallgrass prairie reader. which is the first anthology really to include only tallgrass prairie nature writing in it. But I was under the impression, right, like a lot of people, that the conversion of much of the prairie to corn and beans and cropland was something that was sort of accepted and celebrated, in some case still is in the mythology of this region. But going back and reading the people that are actually there when that happened, that was not the case. There was a great deal of grief and confused feelings, conflicting feelings about the destruction of that diversity, that immense diversity that you talk about, Christina, and the loss of that. And that was a surprising, but also, I think, heartening discovery, that even then there were people who protested in their own ways the destruction of these landscapes.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a common thread in overlooked opportunity. Think of this as overlooked geologic flyover country. And basically you found opportunity in educating people about the richness of the prairie that other people hadn't done. For me, if you're interested in faults and movements, you head to the mountains geologically. And so not many people had looked in the plains. And it opened, I won't go into the detail, but it opened up a very rich research stream that I hope to continue that had been totally overlooked, simple questions that had been totally overlooked. So I think there's great opportunity in the plains, in part maybe because of that perception of the plains as being boring when they are anything but.
Yes.
My favorite map, one of my favorite maps that I often use when I teach geography of the Great Plains, is a 1989 road map of North Dakota, created by the state highway. And on the flip side of it, it has a geologic map of North Dakota. And the text starts out, deep down, North Dakota is an interesting place. which for me, I love the fact that they're countering these perceptions of the plains by literally showing that the underlying geology is a lot more interesting than what meets the eye.
That's great.
Of course, from an ecological perspective, on the surface, the plants growing, there's a huge diversity of ecosystems out there. From the loess hills to the sand hills to the tallgrass prairie, they're all grass, but they're very different grass. They respond very differently to fire or to drought or to any kind of condition. So, and that's kind of, we've all mentioned that each is unique in its own way. The sand hills in particular is a huge system that is not really well studied. As far as the biology of it is, it's being worked on, but that's still an area of open, as Harmon was saying. A lot of things yet to learn out here. And they're all interesting. You just had enough, like a kid in the candy store, you can only do so much. So you try to do as much as you can.
All right, so now I want to kind of flip the question around, and you've spent a long time spending time thinking about the places where you work. How has the place where you work inspired you, as well as your research and scholarship? So were there particular studies or avenues that you pursued because you were inspired by where you work?
Somebody else gets to start. Okay, since no one's going to talk, I'll just get you started anyway. The question about inspiration, my original inspiration came from my major professor, Lloyd Hulbert, where I kind of backed into the things that I'm doing right now. But coming up here, the inspiration, if you will, was the fact that there was a place where I could start applying these things that I had learned, but that I had not intentionally decided to do, but it turns out that's the kind of thing that I was interested in. A lot of times we wander through life until we find something to latch onto. And so I was able to do things here. So the inspiration that I got from here was the site, the place, the opportunities that were here to work in the kind of things that I thought might contribute to both our understanding of this ecosystem and the appreciation. That's one of the reasons why the all preserves, the Glacier Creek as well, attracts people to come there. We had 80 or so more people in the last 2 months coming through, even though the weather was poor. But that's getting people familiar and getting out there, which is what John talked about. So perhaps they can get inspired if they see this landscape where we can look the farthest hill and not see a house, basically. Get some feel with our natural landscape is something like. So that's kind of the inspiration I have is, comes from different sources. I guess we're all inspired by different things, of course.
I think what Tom said about the place being inspirational is at the center. But as a writer, I'm also interested in what they represent metaphorically. And Chris's work has done this too, like charting how metaphors for the land have impacted usage, right? In perceptions from people who have power that don't live here and haven't seen it, right? So I'm interested in what the land represents as well as what it actually is ecologically. So fire, for example, Tom mentioned that, that's become such a powerful metaphor and a link for people trying to find a way into caring about this place, right? This force of fire, which is mostly seen as destructive by most people, something to avoid, right, to get away from. But within the context of prairie ecology, it's a force of healing and renewal and resurrection in a way. And that can be a powerful metaphor. For instance, I've seen this with people who are grieving lost loved ones and have seen in the land and the restoration of the land and the use of fire as a kind of emotional and spiritual force for them, as well as an ecological one. And being involved in the rituals of those community rituals that are abundant in this area, in volunteering to help restore these prairies can be an important source of personal healing for them, as well as ecological healing. So I think the land here still has that immense power, as well as its ecological integrity.
Mm-hmm. Just to kind of pick this up a little bit, those human ties to this landscape are so important. This is a different side of human perception of the plains. There's the misperceptions of the plains, and then there's the perceptions of the people who literally have deep roots here. And those are incredibly important, especially as we look over at controversies like the pipelines, the Dakota Access and the Keystone XL pipelines. There's this disconnect. The people who live off the plains don't understand this deep attachment. And so why not put a pipeline here? There's nothing here. Nobody's attached to it. How can you be attached to nothing, right? But that's not true. They're not seeing it. And so the trick becomes, how do we help them to see it? How do we help them understand these deep roots and these the beauty in these landscapes?
How about you, Harmon?
Yeah, pretty much similar in a way. I'm inspired by the reaction my students have as they learn to see the landscape in new ways. Go out in the sandhills and you realize that what you're looking at is this thin cover of vegetation that has stabilized one of the largest dune fields, something Sahara-like, that periodically comes to life as a desert there. So just getting people, and especially students, to understand the history of the landscape and the implications. For example, a lot of concern about climate and climate change. And Nebraska is a great place through the geology to think about that. We've got glacial deposits underneath our feet. We've got these dune field out west. There, it just opens up people's eyes to the fact that change is to be expected, and then also to be thought about. So yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from other people's reactions and changing their reactions to the plains.
So I want to encourage the audience to enter questions if you have questions of the panelists. The next question that I have is, I think we're all, we've all been really affected by how the pandemic has isolated and socially distanced us, not just from people, but also from our environments. And we've sought out new environments as a consequence. But I guess I wanted you to provide some reflections on, how the pandemic year may have changed, maybe enriched, challenged your relationship to the places where you work.
Well, go ahead, Harmon. Nope, go ahead.
I'll be quick. I can start out just by saying that there's no better place to socially distance than out in the field. So getting out in the field is no problem there. The challenge has been that I can't take students out in the field in the way that I did before. So it sort of truncates that process we talked about earlier, where one can get so much inspiration and reward from introducing people to the landscape and the geology and so forth. So other than that, field work I don't have to worry about, but the ability to work with others, that has been curtailed.
Yeah, I guess the only restriction is it's one person per car, right?
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I have to agree with Harmon, because my biggest concern was just that the inability to get students in the field, one-on-one on a group, basically. That's the biggest loss that we have, and that's a concern moving into the future. If we try to put everything electronic, it's simply not going to work for the field part of education. The students learn so much more hands-on stuff. I don't even care what they do in the field. I think if they just get out there, they learn things just from being there. And that's kind of how I look at things they do in the field. I don't care what they do, as long as they come out and get a feel for it. And I've discovered that students in the past, they'll remember one or two of my labs, and they're always field labs or nothing else. I think that's the biggest loss. The only other thing that I can say for me anyway is that it takes me a lot longer to teach online by the time you do grading and everything else. So I have less time for research in that sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Well, part of my panic about getting the hopefully getting the vaccine, in addition to the safety of my loved ones, is that I gotta get this thing so I can teach my nature writing seminar this summer and get people out to the Glacier Creek. So we're working on that right now, hopefully. But I mean, one thing it's done for me, and I think a lot of other people, has gotten us outside more. I talk about, the audience for my work are people that aren't necessarily inside environmental commitment, right? They're still trying to find the door. And I'm speaking from experience. I'm not someone who has a natural inclination to spend a lot of time outdoors. And so that's been a slow process of choice and practice and commitment. But this pandemic has gotten me out and my family out. We're doing a lot more walks together, more frequent. We've seen little corners and spots right here and there in our neighborhood that I didn't know about, little sort of pockets of wildness. Saw a bobcat run across the cemetery where we walk, and Tom knows about my proclivity to see bobcats.
I think you wonder if it's just something you see and it isn't really there.
I think they're just drawn to me or something. I don't know what it is, but that's been a real joy, and we've sort of claimed in a way in new places, new areas of appreciation by getting outside more together as a family.
I guess, Tom, I shouldn't tell you my mountain lion story. You wouldn't believe me.
Well, we actually have a wildlife camera picture of a bobcat at the preserve now. So now I'm more inclined to believe John than I was before.
See, they treated me like I'd seen Bigfoot out there or something like that. I knew I'd seen a bobcat out there. So I'm glad there's finally proof, Tom.
There is.
Well, and like everyone, I have taken and found respite going out and walking, visiting. I finally visited Nell Woods. I hadn't been out there. So going out and seeing these things, and I took a trip with John's colleague, Barbara Robbins, down to Tulsa in early November. And it was to go see an art exhibit, which was amazing. But just being out and getting out on the plains and seeing a part of the plains that I really hadn't experienced before really was, I mean, I didn't know Tulsa was so nice. I had no idea. Tulsa was a very pleasant surprise, but just getting out and seeing the landscape and learning, that was just hugely rejuvenating. And then the bonus was I actually got to see Alexander Hoag's Mother Earth Laid Bare at the Philbrook Art Museum. And that was just the icing on the cake for that went a long way to help healing that pandemic stuff.
That's great. So it seems like, you know, you've expanded, at least John and Chris, you talk about expanding your places essentially. So that's really great. We have a really wonderful question from an audience member that I'll ask you to answer. And the question is, as you help your students see the Great Plains, what do you tell them to help them feel optimistic about the future of the Great Plains?
Well, that's a great question, and I think one of the biggest challenges in writing about this place is once you're aware of the immensity of the destruction, right? That can have the unfortunate effect of people saying, "Well, what can I do about it? You know, it's beyond hope, so why should I even try?" But I think once people are, first of all, get to see it, what remains, and there is a lot of beautiful, you know, places remaining here. Once they see it, they understand, first of all, what matters in it, why it should be, and when they study it, of course. But I think also seeing the example of people like those who are here, you know, in this group and elsewhere at UNO, who in the community, who are engaging in that restoration work. And I often talk about it as faith work, not in the religious sense, but they are engaging in the restoration of these, in the preservation of these prairies and the study of them, with no guarantee necessarily that they're going to see in their lifetime the fruition of those efforts. So this is a centuries-long effort that these folks are engaged in, and that's a powerful and beautiful act, an important act of faith. And so I try to you know, talk about it in a little bit in that way, to draw inspiration from the people who are committed to the health of this landscape.
After the fire comes the new green grass.
Yes.
You know?
Lots of good metaphors.
Well put.
But also, if you go back to Mother Earth Laid Bare and look very closely, which I never realized until I actually saw the painting close up, around the curve of her hip and down along the water at the bottom in the foreground, there's green grass coming up.
That gives me chills. That's great.
Plus, everyone likes an underdog, right? I mean, this is an underdog landscape. It's like,
Yeah.
I think if they're preserved, one of the things that we can do is show that we have been successful in getting the restoration. We have a huge diversity of plants there, and what's surprising is we're finding the soil itself. With 40 years, we still have a fairly well developed. With only 40 years behind us, we still have roughly maybe 20-30 centimeters of organic accumulation in the surface, suggesting that already the soil is recovering from that system. I think if the students can see that, that's one effort. The other thing is just getting the students out to other places to appreciate nature. So taking them in the field, like to out western Nebraska, where you can go to the Pine Ridge area, or any of those places where they can get out in the field that's natural, and show that there is still habitat left. There are still things out there to care about, and maybe bring that back and look at maybe preserving. There are bits and pieces of prairie around here, or forested areas like Fontenelle and Hummel Park and all those that people could visit and get a feel for. So I think there is some hope there. Again, it depends on how long you look down the road. I think, as John mentioned, you basically plant the oak tree for the next generation or subsequent generations. But if you don't plant that first oak tree, you don't get a 50, 100-year-old oak tree at all.
Yeah, there's a delicate, for me, dance between optimism and pessimism. Because if you're too optimistic, no problem. I don't really need to worry about it, right? If you're too pessimistic, as John said, you know, I give up. So there's a balance there. Optimism may come, though, through focusing on what can be done and using the example so that they realize there are possibilities. It is not impossible. It's not going to be easy, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, I think there's also that first step, and Tom, I think all of you have mentioned this, but just the inspiration part of getting people out there and experiencing it is a huge positive for our students. There's another audience question I think we can take. I've noticed that people on the Western coast love their beautiful grasslands. California is in particular. To my eye, they look very similar to grasslands in this region, minus mountains in the background. Do panelists think perceived rarity is why some grasslands seem to be more valued by society than in the Great Plains, where many people incorrectly assume there's a ton of good quality grassland?
Well, the grasslands of California are not very, the native grasslands are not very many. There's not very many of them. And they're heavily invaded by basically plants brought in by the Spaniards when they came in the, what, 1600s, 1700s, whatever that was. So it's not, but when you start losing system, if you can look at that prairies here and look like the Ohio and other places, their small prairie fragments are highly regarded. Whereas here we have basically nothing but grass, if you include corn in that. And of course the sandhills suggest that there's a whole bunch of it. So I think that there is some, if there's not much of something left, you regard it much more highly than when it's abundant. And I think that's a problem, because the tall grass prairie, most of that's gone now because of agriculture. So it was just ignored at the time, and what's left are fragments. But these fragments are in an area where there's a lot of grass, and so people don't focus too much on trying to protect them. But you go further towards the east, and those little bits and pieces are highly regarded, highly protected, and managed carefully.
Thank you. Well, we're reaching the end of our hour, so I wanted to thank each of you for joining me and having this conversation. It was really nice to see all of you. And to the audience, thank you for joining us as well. It's been a pleasure to have you. The last virtual college seminar will be next month, and there will be information sent out soon about its topic and date and time. So thank you for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, LaReesa. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care.